In this video, we'll show you around the digital worker editor, where you can create simple yet powerful workflows for the products that you use every day. We'll start with the API tasks, which are at the core of what you can do with Xpertly. If you're unfamiliar with APIs, they essentially let you perform a lot of actions you would manually via a set of instructions. First, we'll find the service we would like to interact with in the menu and drag it out to the editor. We can drag the task around the canvas to rearrange things visually, but we'll get further into how to change the flow of this worker a little later on. For now, we can just click on the task to bring up the toolbar, which provides us with a few options, namely Edit, Copy, and Delete. For this worker, we'll be using Meraki to create a network. We want to choose what type of action this task will perform, so we'll click on Edit, which brings up a menu where we can browse all of the available Meraki actions. After searching for the particular action we'd like to make, we can select it to bring up the configuration page. This page is where we will define exactly what instructions we send to Meraki to achieve a particular objective. At the top, we can rename this task to something more specific to the worker or leave it as is. This is up to you and can make the flow of your workers easier to follow. The target URL tells Meraki what particular part of their service we would like to interact with. In this case, we are creating a new network, so the URL represents networks for a particular organization. That brings us to the next field, the path parameters. These are just replacements for sections of the URL, which we will fill in the table below. For this action, we need to specify the ID of the organization we'd like to create a network in, which will be filled in when we run the worker. You can use dynamic variables in these fields to modify the action at runtime, or we can leave it blank and it will be required when we want to run the worker later on. Any required field that is left blank will need to be filled before each run in order for the worker to start. Finally, we have the body field, which is where we can provide details about what we would like to create. The default text in this field gives you a good idea of what the service is expecting. These details are not always required, so you may need to refer to the documentation for the API that you're using. In our case, we only need the name, time zone, and product type fields, so the rest can safely be removed. To make sure everything is set up correctly, we can test this action by itself without the rest of the digital worker running by clicking the test button and selecting which integration to use to make the request. The results of this test will be displayed in the Outputs tab, where we can get a preview of how Meraki is going to respond to this request. Pay close attention to this information, because now that we know what these fields are called, we can make use of them later in our worker to provide more context to later tasks. Now that we know this action is working as intended, we're going to make a couple of changes so it's more useful to whoever wants to run this digital worker. We're going to create a variable using double curly braces notation so that the worker knows to ask for input at runtime. To make inputs on the run form, we need to use the form.notation notation and then provide a name for the field. I'm going to call this field network name. This will make a little more sense later on. With everything in place, we can save this task and move on to another task type. For this worker, we want to send an email when the new network is created, so we'll drag out an email task. If we open up the configuration page for this task, we can see some fields that should be familiar. We'll fill in the fields as desired and then provide a little more context in the body of the email. The Outputs tab of the previous task where we created a Meraki network showed us how Meraki would respond to such a request, and now we can use that information to provide a little more insight to whoever receives this email. Again, using the curly braces notation, I'll refer to the name of the previous task and access its ID output using dot notation. Now this value will be filled by whatever Meraki sends back in that field. With both tasks complete, all we need to do now is link them up to tell Xpertly what order to execute them in, and save the digital worker with a name and description. Moving to the digital worker library, we can now run this worker and see the whole process in action. Tags contain assets from your inventory for digital workers to run against. Selecting multiple tags will run the worker against each separately. Below we have the global variable section, which will contain any variables we declared using the form dot notation in our worker. In this case, we have the network name variable, which will need to be filled in order to run this worker. Below that, we can see an outline of what tasks this worker contains and any variables that might have been left blank. Integrations can also be set per task to further customize the worker, but for now we're just going to use the same one we tested with. Now it's time to click Run and see the worker in action. Now that the worker is running, we can track its progress on this page and look at the output for each task. Moving over to the inbox, we can see that Xpertly sent an email containing details about the network that was just created in the previous task. This is just a simple example to get you started, but Xpertly digital workers can be much more powerful, allowing you to apply automation between services you use frequently with ease.